Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I think we can start the recording if it isn't already started, Ajay. Wonderful. Welcome. I know that we're still going to be ushering people in as we go here, but let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Regenerative Community Summit. And this particular session, I'm very excited about called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice, which is the title of the book that our two distinguished speakers are going to be talking about. We're going to be having a discussion about the contents of the book and maybe some other interesting things as well that we can bring in. So before I get started introducing our speakers, I just want to let you know my name is Jewel Strova. I'm one of the actually one of the organizers of the summit, as well as your host for this session. And if you have any technical issues or needs, you can put in the chat to Ajay, who is our tech host, and I'm sure he'll be happy to help you. Feel free to share any questions or concerns in the chat as well, and we'll try to track those. And we definitely will have time later for questions and answers with the speakers. So hold on to your hats and let's introduce our speakers. I'm going to start with Rupa, because Rupa, I actually met you a few times. I don't know if you remember, but you and I were both at Standing Rock at the same time. And we both know Linda Blackhelt, wonderful. I know you work closely with her. She's also going to be at the summit, by the way. So I'm really excited about that, talking about Indigenous food sovereignty on Thursday evening. Actually, next Tuesday evening. Sorry, I'm getting my days mixed up here. We've got so many different offerings. So Rupa is a physician. She's an activist. She's a mother, a composer. That music you were just listening to, or if you came in late, I'll play some at the end. It's called Rupa and the April Fishes. I've seen her in her band doing amazing music. Some people call it liberation music, which I think is a really good term. She's an associate professor of medicine at the University of California. She teaches, practices and teaches internal medicine. She's a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition, a collective of health workers committed to addressing disease through structural change. And at the invitation of Lakota health leaders, she's also been setting up the Mini-Wachoni Clinic and Farm at Standing Rock, a work that is to decolonize medicine, decolonize food. She's a co-founder of the Deep Medicine Circle, an organization committed to healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, and learning. And she's been working with her husband, the agroecological farmer, Benjamin, I'm gonna mess up the last name pronunciation, Farrer, the Association of Remetush Oloni. She's part of the Farming is Medicine project. And that is really interesting. And she's just doing so many amazing and interesting things, all about decolonizing our food, our medicine, our world. So, and then of course, as I mentioned, she's got her music. She's not already doing enough. So I'm so happy you're here, Rupa. And she's also going to be joining us at the last plenary of this summit on crisis as catalyst for transformation. So check that conversation out. And now I would like to introduce Raj, who I am really happy to have the pleasure of first time meeting. Raj is an award-winning author, filmmaker, academic, political ecologist, food system activist, and policy professor. He's a research professor at the University of Texas. He has degrees from the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics, and Cornell. He's worked for the World Bank and the WTO and protested against them around the world. My kind of guy. Raj co-taught the 2014 edible education class at UC Berkeley with Michael Pollan. And in 2016, he was recognized with the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award, given voice to the global food crisis, and is a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. In addition to scholarly publications, he regularly writes for many distinguished journals. In his other two books, I think it's two, he has book Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and The Value of Nothing, which was a New York Times international bestseller. So Raj, welcome. Rupa, welcome. Really happy to have you.
Thank you, Julie.
Let's see. We're going to just go ahead, and I've introduced you with your kind of your, formal bio, but I thought we'd open this conversation and have each of you introduce yourselves a little bit more, a little bit deeper. I thought we'd start out kind of getting to know both of you a little bit, your background, and then how you're working together, came about, and then the emergent work that you are now presenting, which is this book, and then we'll get into the conversation about that book and the contents, and laying it all out, and then have time for solutions and talking about actions that people can actually take. But before we go there, let's go back up here and I would just like to ask each of you, what are you willing to share about yourself that might be a little bit more personal, that is not in your bio? What makes each of you get up in the morning? What makes you come alive? What is really the reason why you're here and doing this work? What experiences, what aha moments have you had that have contributed to your personal history? So Rupa, do you mind going first to share?
Well, I have two little children, so they often get me up in the morning, but they get me motivated and moving. I have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old child. We're homeschooling them.
Rupa, you're muted.
No, I'm not.
She's not muted.
Can you hear me? You can hear
you fine.
Thank you. So what gets me up is, like I said, my children. And then what gets me moving and motivated is my children. Just, I can't describe
what's happening. Ajay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It must be a dual
Audio's
setup.
fine.
Sorry.
Okay, I can't hear her.
Keep going, Rupa.
Okay. So just, realizing what time it is, what the earth is telling us, what time it is, the feeling of worrying about, keeping a fire bag ready to go, during the last few months, having the car parked a certain way in the driveway to be ready to go during, red flag warnings. It's just a very intense time to be raising children, not to be able to go outside for a week or 2 or 3, depending on air quality, not being able to be inside because of COVID. So all of these things have been, just very motivating and crystallizing of how we need to get to work. Something very beautiful that just happened yesterday and this week is we have been cultivating a butterfly garden in our Oakland homestead where we live. We have 2 neighbors on either sides who've removed their fences. So we have about an acre of land that we're managing. And we've just planted a bunch of forage for bees and butterflies. And we had 3 monarch caterpillars, in a jar with all the milkweed and a, covering that they could have enough oxygen in, and they built their chrysalises. And one by one, they've come out in the last 3 days, and every single one has just been a wonder. And it's amazing because they're overwintering in the garden, and to see how much can be done just with creating habitat and care is really cool. And it just makes me think if, thousands of us did this, how we could support, their movements. And yeah, it's beautiful. So they're flying around the garden. My kids are totally enthralled. I'm making music because it's so inspiring. So that's what kind of keeps me going, is those little beautiful things.
Thank you. I'm so glad I caught most of that. And my apologies. There was a problem with my computer sound and I got it fixed. So I'm now hearing you perfectly. And apologies for that little, that's part of this whole thing, is just we roll with the glitches, right? So that was amazing. How about you, Raj?
Well, thank you, Jewel, and thank you all for being here. I'm, I mean, look, my journey was one really kicked off when I was pretty young. I was 5 when we were in the land of my ancestors in India with my parents, and we were stuck in a traffic jam, and it was the monsoon, and there was a girl outside our car window, can't have been more than 12 years old, and she had an infant in her hands, and she was sort of keening backwards and forwards and asking for money and asking for food. And I remember losing my shit. I remember just wigging out completely and being very, very angry and upset about why we were dry and she was wet, and she was hungry and we weren't, and we had money and she didn't. And my parents sort of cracked down the windscreen and pressed some money out, and we sped off into the night. But that girl is the motivation in part. I mean, I think about her more than perhaps is healthy, but I wonder where she is and what has become of her, because as soon as I got back to England, I started renting out my toys in kindergarten so that we could send money for hunger relief. And I've just been spending a while trying to figure out, why is she, was she outside? Why do we live in a world where that kind of thing is normal? And I haven't got any good answers. There are lots of bad answers. And so my journey has been around figuring out why that happens and why it's allowed to happen, and figuring out new ways of bridging the divides between places with, working with movements that are doing that. And I've been lucky enough to work with peasant movements the world over. And we'll talk about this in a second, I think, when we talk about the origins of this book. But talking with movements across the planet around how we can stop that kind of hunger. And so, that's sort of been my journey. Originally, I thought, well, we can figure this out with just enough mathematics. And so I ended up studying mathematics for a bit, and then realizing that while economists dress up their equations in a variety of Greek, there's not much behind it. And so I'm not intimidated by economists in ways that some people are. And it occurs to me that in fact these institutions are not based on good science. Institutions like the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, they're not based on good science or top level economic practice. They're based on inequalities of power and entrenching them. And that's why quite a lot of my life has been about addressing those inequalities in power and figuring out new ways of engaging with and working to commit class suicide, so that my fairly privileged upbringing gets to be in support of some of the movements that are on the ground fighting. And so whether that's with the film that I recently co-directed with a bunch of folk called The Ants and the Grasshopper, that's about agroecology and climate change and white supremacy and how to end that, or whether it's about doing stuff around the food system and the UN Food System Summit that's just happened. That's the sort of journey I'm on, and that's why it was such an honor to work with Rupa on this latest chapter of that process of confronting inequalities in power. So perhaps we can talk about that next.
That's perfect, because the next question I was going to ask is how you guys began, what brought you together to begin this work. So a little bit of what brought you, what first was a little bit of your background that brought you to meet, and then how did you end up starting to work together?
Well, we were protesting the food system, so GMO foods together. I was playing in my band. Raj was a GMO tomato. And we, got to know each other through that scene in San Francisco and became good friends in that friendship, through the discussion of our passions around myself in medicine, seeing how inequality was registering in the bodies of people. I often say that as a hospital medicine doctor, we're at the bleeding edge of society. We can see who's getting hurt, how they're getting hurt. And with a little bit of, understanding and imagination, you can think of more effective ways at changing health outcomes than what we have right now. And those are structural changes, which is what Raj and I go through in the book. But so it really was a meeting of, I would say through that work that we do, which is in the really rich space of the imagination, imagining other worlds and other ways. And part of that involves protesting the ways right now we see that are horribly unfair and unhealthy.
Wonderful. And you, Raj?
Yes, I was a tomato, a genetically modified one. I think for me, the privilege was being able to recognize that when I'd been invited into spaces that were of peasant movements, I was there as a friend to the movement, engaging in activism around what I thought was the food system, in which the movements were telling me, not explicitly, but very clearly nonetheless, that this was not just about food. This was about medicine. It was about culture. It was about everything. It was about a way of life. It's about how one comports oneself with respect to other living beings and with respect to histories of inequalities of power, and how one comports oneself with respect to the soil and with respect to the butterflies. And I was aware of that, but I think working on this project together really knitted and reminded me that these divisions between food and medicine are colonial and artificial, and that many of the movements that we've all spent time with are ones where we, that are part of a colonial heritage that's important to make strange. And so when Rupa came to talk here at the Dell Medical School in Austin, Texas, occupied Austin, Texas, at that, we had this conversation and realized that there's much more to this conversation than we could fit into our time together. And we realized we had a book to write.
Wonderful. I'm kind of curious if both of your experiences with the medical system, our healthcare system, and how colonized it is, and how in the lack of equity in terms of who gets treatment and the profiteering and all of that, if that also fed into the work that you're doing now.
Absolutely. So, a huge part of decolonizing medicine is, as Raj said, understanding that it wasn't separate from these things that kept us healthy, like food and water and the air that we breathe, or the fire medicine. So California right now is in complete disarray because the medicines of fire and water have been so grossly abused, and soil. Yes, that under the architecture of colonialism in which Western medicine was developed, the practice of Western medicine was developed, and the institutions of medicine were formed, are still there. And so we should not be surprised when Black and brown people have worse health outcomes, when poor people have worse health outcomes. It's not simply a matter of access, although access is critical and important, but it's also what happens when you do access the care structures and how you are perceived and how you are treated. So the racism that is so much a part of every aspect of Western colonial nations, the United States being one of them, is pervasive in every institution, from the environmental movement to the hospital. And so it's critical that we start to decolonize all of those spaces. So, we shouldn't be talking, the Sierra Club has no place of leadership in the environmental movement if Indigenous grandmothers are not, at the forefront, and they're not falling in line with their agendas that they're setting. And so I think it's important to reckon with our histories, because the challenges we're facing from a human existential standpoint of climate change and the pandemic, even right now, are things where colonial structures have hastened these these experiences, this instability.
Thank you. Raj, do you want to add anything or your thoughts
Who
on
could
that?
add to that? That's she said it.
Great. And so now here you are. You came together and you decided to work on this book. And let's go ahead and just kind of lay out let you both kind of just in conversational style now, just go ahead and share with us kind of the premise of the book, the argument that you're laying out for people, and then we'll get into a little discussion around that. So I just want people to understand what it is that who hasn't read your book, and hopefully they will after this. They're going to all go buy your book. But yeah, just go ahead and whoever wants to jump in.
So Rupa, let's have the conversation then. So what is inflammation?
Raj, inflammation is a really important response of our bodies to damage and the threat of damage. Inflammation is the body responding appropriately to damage and the threat of damage. And what we see is that most of the diseases that people who live in modern industrialized societies suffer from are really characterized by inflammation, by chronic sterile inflammation. So normally when you have a paper cut and like right here, and the blood rushes and you have the clotting of the blood and then the wound healing, that wound healing response is the inflammatory response. So it's a healing reparative response. However, normally in that acute setting, once the wound is healed, the inflammatory response turns off. And with the diseases that we see, the damage is ongoing that the body is experiencing, and so the inflammation never stops. And what we talk about in our book, which I'm really grateful for, is like the time to articulate this, that the cause of disease, the pathological, the entity that's causing the pathology is not within the body. It's within the architecture around the body. It's within the histories. It's within the traumas. It's within the poisoned water and soil and air. And a lot of those things, almost all of them, have been really advanced by the capitalist colonial state, states or nation states around the world. And so in order to stop this inflammation and give our bodies a chance to heal and the earth a chance to heal, we have to interrupt that programming. Raj, what do you say? How are we going to interrupt it?
So some people might think, well, all right, well, what we need is an anti-inflammatory diet. We must transition, since we're in a conversation about transition. We must transition away from the bad diet that is driving planetary destruction and move to a diet that is anti-inflammatory. And there are lots of diets like that. We're hearing more and more about how we all need to transition to the anti-inflammatory diet. And that, of course, is tremendously short-sighted because it circumscribes the domain in which we're concerned about transitioning from our mouths to our anuses, and anything else outside that seems to be beyond the scope of transition. And that's that's why we spend a lot of time in this book railing against the individualistic kinds of approaches to inflammation that you can find in the pages of the New York Times. You can find them on the shelves of Whole Foods or Berkeley Bowl, that's more appropriately. But it's still the case that while it is important to feed our internal microbiome and the millions of living things, the millions of species within us, we need also to pay attention to the fact that these species depend on a world around us being made whole once again. And so the way that we talk about the appropriate response in the book is to say, look, it would be wonderful if we could have a deeply and truly anti-inflammatory diet, like the blue zones around the world. Folk here may be familiar with the blue zones, places in the world where people live, we have loads of centenarians. And we were having a lovely conversation earlier on this year with Dr. Mark Hyman, who was just off to Sardinia to study the blue zone there. And he couldn't because Sardinia was on fire. Ultimately, the place where these diets are from are now subject to climate change. One of the other places where there's a fantastic diet that we write about in Inflamed is Okinawa. And the Okinawan diet, people love the Okinawan diet, so anti-inflammatory. It's purple potatoes and a range of seaweed and lots of cultivation, and also part of the diet is having a robust and active social life and having friends and really being able to be out and about in the world and in nature. And so much of that now is impossible in Okinawa because of colonialism, because the best agricultural land in Okinawa is occupied by a US air base. And if we are interested in an Okinawan diet, then we must have an Okinawa in which that diet can survive. And so part of what we're suggesting in Inflamed is something called the deep medicine of decolonization. Rupa, what is that?
Well, Raj, it's about getting militant about seizing that land back from those militant against militarism itself, about actually activating to take that power back for the goods of for the good of the people, for the use of the people, and for the use not just of the people, but the whole ecosystem. And so, like deep ecology doesn't center human beings in the concept of what a healthy ecosystem should look like, deep medicine doesn't center the individual. It looks at how systems are interacting, systems within our bodies, around our bodies, systems that are microbial and systems that are macroeconomic, and that all of these things interact to either create health or illness. And so the deep medicine of decolonization acts on all of these axes.
But what is it? I mean, can I take a pill for this stuff, Rupa?
No, Raj,
is there not a transition US compatible?
Now, you can't take a pill from it. I mean, I know there's people out there trying to currently turn Yanomami shit into gold, into a rewilding gut probiotic.
You should explain that. Well, so Yanomami and
yeah. So what we know is that inflammatory disease is our bodies are protected from inflammatory disease by having a healthy gut microbiome. And if you look at the different gut microbiota around the world, and these are the organisms that live inside and colonize or take up residence in our, I shouldn't use the word colonize, take up residence and have a reciprocal relationship with us in our gut. We feed them and they end up giving us all these metabolic benefits. They end up signaling our brain development in utero. They end up shaping and tuning our immune system to tolerate certain things, to respond with a lot of inflammatory response or with less. And so when we don't have a robust biodiverse gut microbiome, we are more prone to inflammatory disease. And there was a fascinating study that showed that people taking cancer immunotherapy right now, if the cancer immunotherapy is not working, they put these folks on probiotics to improve the biodiversity of their gut. And then the cancer immunotherapy started working. It was more effective. So these organisms are so critical to how our body, especially our immune system, reacts on our inflammatory response, that scientists are starting to look at, okay, well, in the US that has the least biodiverse guts on planet Earth, where are the most biodiverse? And what we find is that it's in hunter-gatherer societies, it's in traditional societies that have not been colonized by modern industrial society. And so the Yanomami, the indigenous communities that live in the Amazon rainforest, have the most biodiverse guts on Earth. And so the thought is, well, the capitalist thought is, can't you just go there and take their poop and do a fecal transplant? So take their poop and petri dish it out and then cultivate it and make little pills, and everyone can just buy it off of Goop, fancy, Yanomami poop for $100 a pop. rewild your gut. I think that was the headline. But in fact, you can't, because organisms don't stay around just because you pop them as a pill. The microbiome in the gut is a living reflection of all these relationships, of ecological relationships, of human and animal and human and plant relationships, human and soil relationships. And so it can't just be, you can't take that complexity and just pop it in a pill. It has to be a lived experience. So that is, what decolonization is understanding, is that it's not something you do alone. It's something you do in community. It's not something you do through a consumerist act. It's about repairing those relationships that have been critically harmed through colonialism. And those are the relationships of ourselves to one another, ourselves to the indigenous people to the lands. I'm speaking to you today from occupied unceded territory of Huichin, Ohlone territory, that once we can fall behind the agendas of indigenous people to reclaim their foodways, reclaim their medicine ways, reclaim their lands, reclaim their sovereignty over waters, we can have the opportunity to live in these places in a healthier way. And what has been fascinating about the research we found, Raj, I was surprised, was that biodiversity, both inside and outside the body, is most protected by those people who have cosmologies outside the Western framework, outside of a framework of domination, and entering frameworks of relationality with the entire web of life. And that is, I think, a central concept to the decolonization that we articulate in the book.
Rupa and Raj, I'm wondering, you in your book, you use metaphor. You talk about the earth, the anatomy, comparing that to our anatomy. And I'm just wondering if you maybe could speak a little bit about that as well. And also, I'm sure you're familiar with the Gaia hypothesis. It evoked that in me. So I don't know if there's any of that, that philosophy that has informed you in any way or not, in talking about the earth as a whole system, a living system that is reflected in our health.
Well, certainly, let me pick up what Rupa just put down there, which is the idea of colonial cosmologies, right? The idea of a cosmology is a way of understanding our place in the universe. We look up at the sky and we figure out where we are, and we look around us and we understand our relationships to other beings, and we get to adjudicate what is a being and what isn't through a cosmology. Colonial capitalist cosmology is something that we spend a fair amount of time talking about. And I think it's worth just diving into that a little bit to explain why, where Gaia fits, but also what the alternatives to it might be. Because, when we think about the planet inflamed, we're not just using it as a metaphor, we're actually using it as a very direct series of physical causes and effects that go from a planet on fire to inflamed lungs to COVID to a range of other things. But let's take the step back though, and ask why our planet is on fire. The reason that our planet is on fire is because of the confluence of two strange forces. One is colonialism. Colonialism's old. Romans used to do it. Romans, in fact, had vocabulary for beings who were sort of free, but not, and a little different from Romans. When the Romans were sort of running around the Mediterranean, conquering cities, they needed a way of saying, look, y'all are, you're free. You're welcome to the empire. Have a nice day. Except you aren't like us. You aren't quite as good as us. You don't have the same the same status as us in Rome. And one of the ways that you could observe the status in Rome was through the duties, the munera, that Roman citizens had to perform that no one else within the empire did. And so for conquered cities that were free, they were known as immunes. And that idea of immunity comes from the language of colonialism, of something that has been encompassed but is not like us, and frankly not as good as us. Now, when you have that kind of valence to understanding how the world works, and you couple that with capitalism, you're into fairly toxic territory, because what capitalism does is, through colonialism, operate at a frontier where there's really sort of two big classes. On the one hand, there's society. In society, there are men with property, usually white and elitist, a part of an elite rather. Now that propertied class of white men arrogates to itself the right to take anything it wants from nature. In the world of nature is, according to this capitalist colonialist cosmology, everything else and everyone else. So whether it is women or whether it is the working class or whether it is people of color, whether it's indigenous people, whether it's people who have been enslaved, whether it is rivers, whether it's mountains, whether it's other species, other beings, other mammals, other bacteria, other kingdoms of life, all of those are in nature and they can be put to work and worked until death. They can be set aflame and their energy can be released for profit. And so capitalist colonialist cosmology, where you constantly move the frontier forward and try and bring yet more nature under your domain, whether that nature is the DNA of a virus or asteroids and space mines, all of these frontiers are ways in which society decides that's nature and we can privatize that and profit from it. Now, the reason to go on this long sort of journey is if we're interested in transitioning away from that, we've got a lot of work to do conceptually. Because if we're transitioning away from a capitalist colonialist paradigm, then we need to recognize that it is patriarchal, that it is racist, that it is based on models of exploitation that deny personhood to the rest of the web of life. That also leads us to sort of categorical errors of thinking, well, our body is a body politic, our body is a body, and then society is a body politic, and then the planet is sort of, its own being, as opposed to recognizing that we constitute one another. And so the Gaia hypothesis is a way of talking cosmologically about the planet, which is one among many cosmologies that are important to remember and recognize. But what we explore in the book is how different cosmologies emerging from different places and different times will have their own valences and values and are embedded in place and in territory. And I wonder whether there, Rupa, would be a good place for me to hand off to you to talk about this metaphor a little more explicitly.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. I feel like when we think of, for me, that what we're calling metaphor really comes in strong when I think of the soil. So just like the gut with its microbiology, the gut is the transitional zone or ecotone between our bodies and the world around us. So it's the way that nutrients come in and we get to, our microbes help us move those into the gut, help to maintain the barrier of the gut to hold on to water, to not get too leaky or inflamed. And just as that, the soil, sorry, 3-year-old. So just also in that same way, the soil is this transition zone between, the air, the water, and what becomes between the inorganic and organic states of being. And it's the way that nutrients, the microbes in the soil and the fungi mobilize the nutrients and make them available for the plants and available for ultimately other animals. And so when you looked at it like that, and I really started to see it when I was looking at my patients who had inflammatory bowel disease and looking at their stool cultures. And then looking at the microbiology of the soil that had been blasted by pesticides. And you saw a same kind of leakiness in that soil. It wouldn't hold on to water the same way. It couldn't mobilize nutrients from the soil into the food the same way. So I really started to see these similarities between how the body, the human body, was also reflected in the earth. And another parallel we draw is between, or that we see is between, the pump of the heart that moves the resources of energy and nutrients around the body, and the salmon that move the nutrients from the ocean deep into like thousands of miles into up the vasculature of our rivers, and what happens when that those systems are blocked. And that was the amazing thing for me to think about with this book, was how capitalism and its systems of control to keep the resources, the control of the resources in the hands of very few people, starting with just even the concept of private property, which was, never here until several hundred years ago. It didn't exist. It wasn't the way people thought, that indigenous people thought of land here. Sure, people had territories in regions where they had their homelands and their villages, but no one would ever say, this river is mine or this land is mine, because it was a system of relationships between people and between the land. And so when you started to see the control of those resources through capitalism, you see how systems start collapsing. They're not as robust and resilient as they are in systems of mutuality and relationship.
Wow, that's beautifully said, both of you. And you're kind of making me think, and now whether this is a metaphor or whether it's literal, I don't know, but could colonialism be characterized as a parasite, a consciousness, a parasitic kind of consciousness? I mean, everything exists already, right? So parasites, viruses, bad things as well as good things in the whole system of life, but they're kept in check. So could this idea of colonization be, how could that be characterized in this template that you're laying out?
Well, Jack Forbes has a great book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, and he really lays out this mindset that has been in humanity for a really, really long time. So it's not like the only, horrific people that destroyed their ecosystems were the Europeans who've damaged the world with this current version of colonialism. But the Europeans actually are the first ones to advance a system that actually would cause planetary collapse. And why is that? And it's because of the bringing together of colonialism and capitalism, that these two things together created, I don't know if I would call it parasitic, but what Jack Forbes refers to as a cannibalistic, he calls it a spirit sickness, where the need to amass energy or, resources for oneself, as opposed to understanding the value of the whole, and the necessity of keeping the whole in balance. And so I think it is actually critical that we become literate around, what capitalism is and what it has done, and what it will continue to do. So we don't have these slippery, conscious capitalists coming around trying to sell us everything we need to save the world right now, because that mentality is the problem.
And also, the idea of a parasite is now biologically a little more complex. So we understand that actually parasites can serve to regulate our bodies, and if our bodies have grown up in contexts in which parasites are rife, they may actually be an important part of our immune system, rather than the blood funnel sucking away, the sort of vampire that capitalism is. So again, this is just to amplify the fact that there's something very weird about capitalism, that it is a system that's pretty new. I mean, it's 600 years old in the history of civilization. That's wildly new, and already it's done a fantastic job of just destroying a planet that and a sort of phase of life that's existed for eons. And so, this is a mark of certain kinds of will to death, and will to flame, and the worst kind of flame, right? A will to extinction that that capitalism has, much more than I think any other civilization has quite managed to put together.
Yes, it's funny because a couple people went in the chat. What I was actually going to say was, you reminded me of the term Watiko. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the general malaise, sickness. It's like a soul sickness that we are experiencing, and how do we get out from underneath that soul sickness? Because we are, there are many people that are just, it's all they can do to survive. And the capital is it's gotten to this point now where there's, the homeless are, the growth of the homeless camps has just been off the charts everywhere, is and climate refugees, so on and so forth, and people are just doing what they can to survive, and there's just this deep despair that I think a lot of us are sensing. And those of us who have more privilege and ability to do something about it obviously need to take that responsibility. But what would you say, is something that, in the face of this, that we really can be doing? And I know you're talking about decolonizing. Maybe you can give us some more specifics about that.
Yeah, so I hear, that people are just trying to get by. And going back to Raj's description in India, where I also had the chance to go when I was quite young, with my grandparents, and had the same, shock, because I was born in the United States and saw the disparity, and was just racked by questions of how did I land in this existence and that child is there, that horror. So I think that, instead of despair is organizing. So Berlin just got 240,000 housing units moved from the capitalist real estate market into socialized public housing. So our real estate, our housing crisis is not a crisis of housing. There's plenty of housing. There's so many empty units in San Francisco. It's a crisis of people having enough will to walk off their jobs and not go back until every person is put into a home, that every person is offered a home, that we actually know what the solutions are. If, everyone needs healthcare, everyone needs an access to great, educational opportunities. Everyone needs access to healthy food, not food that's, traced and laced with chemical residues. Everyone needs healthy water. So these things, food, shelter, water, medicine, these are things that we have not only a right to, but a responsibility to bring about. And it's much harder in a society where the structures have been so created to manufacture our desperation, so that we are constantly in the state that you're describing, Jules. Like, I'm just trying to get by. I can't possibly do that because I'm just trying to get by. And so it's a great time to work with mutual aid societies to start building and cultivating those relationships. And a great time to be following the leadership of groups that have been doing this work already for a long time. And a lot of those are racial justice groups, indigenous groups, farming movements, peasant farming movements around the world. And so I think that, if decolonization is really learning how to flip the power structure and to understand our power as not as individuals, but as collectives. And that really is, the care revolution, that we insist upon care over everything else. And that's going to become more and more an issue, as pandemic hits, climate catastrophe, as we saw with, the Delta surge, and people still left outside here in the streets of San Francisco while the AQI is, 250. We don't yet have that care enough to walk out together and seize a hotel and just let, we have way more people than any other structure. But once we start to collectively organize, that becomes possible, and then laws can be written. But sometimes in these moments of crises, there are moments of opportunity where it becomes very clear. Do we leave 8,000 people on the street? Well, Mayor London Breed says yes. The Board of Supervisors voted no. What did the people of San Francisco do? We're still so indoctrinated in the individual mindset. that we like, I just got to get by for myself and my family. And that's where I think really the despair comes from, because truly it's in the joining with other groups and other people that we start to feel hope, that we start to see that, oh, actually, if we collectively bring our power together, we can start to move this much faster. And then we don't have our community members suffering the way that they do.
And just as an antidote to the smugness that exists in the Bay Area when thinking about Texas, it's true that we're our time zone is 2 hours ahead and 20 years behind. But Austin did, in fact, what San Francisco should have done, and rented out the Hampton Inn and then a few other hotels, and that's where on-house folk were during the pandemic. And we did that here because, again, I mean, there are some ways in which Texas is horribly recidivist and remains the state where slavery was fought for twice, and at the same time there are parts of this there are communities that are capable of seeing through, exactly as Rupa suggested, that in fact when there are all these vacant places for folk to live and folk who need places to live, it's possible to put two and two together. And in fact, it ended up being cost effective here as well. But I mean, I do want to point out that there's an uncomfortable message here for folk who are interested in transition. Because we're not pulling this idea of decolonization out of our asses. This has a long history, and part of what we're doing is drawing on, in fact, medics who are practicing the idea of decolonization. One of them is Frantz Fanon, who people may know as the author of Black Skin, White Masks or Wretched of the Earth, but who was a practicing psychiatrist in Algeria when the French were busy colonizing and killing Algerians. He was practicing psychiatry there, and he had under his care a ward of middle-class settler women, and his treatment, his way of decolonizing psychiatry was rather than sort of locking people up and over-medicating them, to listen to what these women wanted. And what they wanted was ways of expressing and controlling the ways that they were talked about and seen and shown. And so he made it possible for there to be a newspaper and a film club. But for working class Algerian men, that's not what they wanted. What they wanted was to be outside the boundaries of the hospital and on fields playing soccer, and away from the reminders of the architecture of colonialism. And in the end, of course, Frantz Fanon walks away from the hospital in part, and this is a line that we use in the book, because the physician often owns the land, or the doctor often owns the land. And that's important because one of the things we point out in Inflamed is that private property is really one of the most important instruments of colonialism. And committing that institution to the flames is also then to commit its attendant institutions like the police, like certain kinds of education, like certain kinds of medical care, like certain kinds of government, because all of these exist in order to patrol and police private property. And so if we're serious about transitioning away from colonial capitalism, then private property has to be in the crosshairs. And that's awkward because we would rather transition being, windmills and community gardens. And I'm down with windmills and community gardens, but that's not enough. And the ways in which we collectively manage the transition away from the kinds of private property we have at the moment to a kind of rematriated territory is very difficult. And yet it is entirely necessary because, as we've already argued, colonial capitalism depends on this institution. And the minute you undo it is the minute we start having a chance at a future that recognizes the other beings in our web of life. But that's why Rupa's project of the Deep Medicine Circle is so important. I'm very much hoping we get to talk about that before we jump into questions.
Yeah, let's get to that in a moment. But I do want to say, in response to you, Raj, that if I may be so bold, I believe that the transition movement, which we are part of, is a decolonizing movement, though we haven't explicitly called it that. And people in the network are in various degrees of connecting those dots. And that's what we're trying to do here at the summit. We do have a decolonizing workshop next week, as well as several other ones that are going to be talking about decolonizing. So we're very much on the same page with you, Raj, and we're doing the work. That's what we're here to do, and we're really happy that you are championing it, you and Rupa are, in your work. So, but as I want to just say one thing about land, there's a lot of talk about land trusts, uh, uh, nature rights, things like that, community rights. So there are a lot of people having different discussions around the subjects that you brought up. So it's a very exciting time, and there's a lot of wonderful stuff that's coming up. So I hope you can stick around for some of the other things at the summit and and meet some of the people that are doing some amazing stuff along those lines. So yeah, let's go back to what you wanted to have Rupa talk about deep medicine, and I am very curious about that too. So Rupa, would you like to share about that?
Yeah, we started an organization this year. Myself, my husband, some other women of color, called the Deep Medicine Circle. And we are a worker-directed nonprofit. We're women of color and Indigenous women led. And we work to heal the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, restoration, story, and learning. And part of our work, that our first project we're really diving into, is a project we're calling Farming as Medicine, both on 38 acres of land in Ramaytush Ohlone territory that we are in discussion with different groups around rematriating that land. So getting it back in the hands of Indigenous women. We are also doing an acre of rooftop farm that was designed and built by my husband, Benjamin Farr, and we've taken over the running of that. And what Farming of Medicine is reframing farmers. And we've hired women of color as amazing women, 2 women, Elena Reed and Flora Velorio, as our farm directors on each site. Under the auspices of Sage La Pena, who's an incredible plant medicine woman and who's come on as our director of traditional ecological knowledge. She's California native from several different groups. So we work to reframe farmers as ecological stewards, and their practice as a practice of care. So in their care for the earth, in the care for the water, in the care for the seeds, they grow this food. And the food is then liberated. They don't have to make, per pound of broccoli, per pound of lettuce, a certain amount. That food is then liberated to people who are being oppressed by these same structures of colonialism. So Black, Brown, and Indigenous and poor people in urban centers. So in San Francisco, we're giving our food away to the American Indian Cultural District. We're giving the food to the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. In Oakland, we just did 143 pounds of fresh food, went right next door to the community clinic that's run through UCSF. It's a pediatrics clinic. So every family that comes can have a box of, delicious, healthy, organic. We call it more organic because we're working with soil fertility and microbiology. So this food is what food should be, which is both prebiotic and probiotic. And in our work, we're training young doctors, young farmers, bringing them together with activists, Moms for Housing, who occupy the speculative, empty, property in Oakland and claimed it for Oakland Land Trust to house unsheltered mothers. It is really, beautiful work, in part because it's led by people who come from these impacted communities and who know what people need. And so if the work of Just Transitions is decolonizing, if it is a predominantly white space, I would say you're not there yet, because most people who are impacted by the need for transition are not in general white, they're people of color. And so that is, decolonizing is not, again, something we can do on our own. It means developing new kinds of relationships where those power structures are changed and challenged. And so that's been amazing, challenging, beautiful work. And our other work, Sage La Pena and I are developing a clinic to decolonize medicine. We're doing work we're calling From Seed to Patient. And we'll be starting to see patients together soon. This winter, we're just building out our herbal apothecary. And advancing some more of these ideas that I incubated at Standing Rock in the clinic that's happening out there. And that Sage has been incubating, in her work as a California Native practitioner. So it's really beautiful. It's beautiful. And we're grateful for all the support we've received. I am been invited to speak to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco next week to talk about our model, because they're very interested in how it meets climate justice, racial justice, social justice, and health justice goals. And so it should, I think ideally these are things where food is publicly funded. And by that, I mean farmers' livelihoods are uplifted as frontline health workers. So they make salaries that, are reflective of their important duties they carry to care for the earth and care for our health, because our health is starting in the soil. And so it's exciting. We can we can sink more CO2 and grow more food and have healthier communities through this kind of work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very inspiring what you're doing. And yeah, and I agree with what you've said, that and transition is really dedicated right now to tilling the ground for authentic and real relationships with people outside of our circles, our bubble, the white bubble, if you will, to build real relationships, not just, virtue signaling or tokenizing, but to really understand, how can we work together cross-culturally? How can we heal together? And so you're really presencing that now, and thank you so much. Raj, do you want to add anything to that? I have a question for you both, but I want to finish this thread.
No, please. Let's move on to hearing other folks' questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to read. People can put their questions in the chat, but I have a question that I've been musing on after really looking at your book and thinking about the water, because I think about inflammation. I think about the water. Inflammation is an issue of swelling and water in our body, and it's trying to get rid of whatever poison or whatever it's trying to do, and chronic inflammation being that there's just too much input, right? Too much poison coming in, not enough time for it to do the body to do what it needs to do. So I'm thinking about how to connect that to the earth and the water systems of the earth, and like the liver being the main organ that cleanses our blood, being the water. I was just trying to metaphorically compare those two, and I also I hope I'm not being too obtuse here, but I was also thinking about the epidemic of alcoholism and alcohol and sugar-related diets and things like these that tax the liver and create inflammation in the body as well, and the connection to water on the earth. Now, if that's too out there, just let me know. But I'm wondering if you could say anything about that.
Well, the leading cause of liver failure now in the United States is an inflammatory process called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's not even alcohol anymore, which is shocking. And the inflammatory condition of NAFLD, doctors scratch their heads and say, well, we don't know what's causing that. But it's part of the same suite of inflammatory experiences that modern industrialized humans living in capitalist societies are experiencing. There are concerns about dietary chemicals. There's concerns about Roundup. There's concerns about, how our food is grown and what we're being exposed to. But I would say that, our waters are endangered all over the planet. So, protecting those waters, those brave people who are public health workers. So the people trying to stop line 3, they are public health workers. The people who still are trying to push for DAPL to shut down are public health workers. I think shutting down the fossil fuel industry is critical to getting the possibility of healthier water. Also, shutting down industrial agriculture in California because it's an abuser of our water. So our state's on fire and we haven't had a discussion on reallocating water resources. Instead, there's plans to build, more infrastructure that would take water away from where it's needed to support a healthy, thriving ecosystem. What's interesting to me is, thinking about our California indigenous communities. And Chief Kayleen Sisk of the Winnemem-Wintu right now is, worried about her home and the village up there because of the fawn fire. So some woman from Palo Alto went up and decided to start a fire in Shasta County. And there's just this imbalance in the fire and the water in California. And one of the stories I remember that my elder Greg Castro told me was that he was listening to someone who was a practitioner of fire medicine, and they said that, you know, when you light the fires, when you burn the lamp ceremonially, that's how the water comes back. And for a Western practitioner, this makes no sense. But they ended up getting the permits and everything to burn an area, and pretty, soon, 2-3 years, the water was coming back. So there's these knowledges that on how to live in this land in a better way, in a more sane way, that are still here. California Native communities still have these, there are some places where there's uninterrupted knowledge, and that really needs to be uplifted and given places of authority in what we're doing, because colonizers have destroyed the ecosystems of California, and we're trying to patch it up with little fixes. But those fixes, in light of something like the industrial agriculture, the CAFOs, the Central Valley, it makes no sense. There's no way that system is going to come into any ecological balance. It needs to be abolished and eliminated. And we need to reimagine what our agricultural system should look like here.
Whew. Thank you. Raj, do you want to say anything on that subject?
Well, I mean, it's hard to add to that, but I do want to just maybe think about how we've been talking about, say, or the way that we talk about the immune system, and certainly what one of the things that I came away with after reading Inflamed was a different way of understanding how we live with things. I mean, just even the language of our bodies and purity and immunity and contamination are a little weird, right? So your nose is all stuffed up and you're a bit bunged up and your head hurts. So you'll say, "Oh, I'm fighting something off." And that language of warfare and of self and other and of sort of bodily purity versus contamination and infection owes its origins to colonialism and a practice of understanding how it is that we hold ourselves in time and space. And so these days, rather than saying, "Oh, I'm fighting something off," I try and correct myself and say, "Well, I'm trying to live with something." And that shift in thinking about how we hold ourselves in, how our bodies are holding in a planet that's on fire, I think is worth remembering, because otherwise we will forget that, as Rupa was saying, fire can cleanse and be purifying, just the same way that the inflammatory response is generally a good thing. It's only when our inflammatory responses are always triggered because we live in a world that is unsupportable. To use the French word, insupportable. And so, if we've got, if we're living in an unconscionable world, and our bodies are reacting because we can't live with this, our bodies are telling us we can't live with this, we can't live with this, then we need to live with something different. And that difference is precisely in using the same ideas of fire and water, but using them in a way that respects the beings that live in and through them. And that's a very different way of understanding the power of the flame than capitalism allows us to.
Yeah, you're reminding me that many of my Indigenous friends actually really do hold the fires, for instance, in California, where I live, differently than you hear about in the media. It's not seen as a bad thing. And it really is seen as like this is purification.
Yeah, I mean, we begin our book with a quotation from ancient Hindu scripture that talks about the fire teaching students, and that's that idea that the fire is here to teach is something that we're just too arrogant to understand, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Boy, we could keep talking about that, but I do see a question in the chat for you, Raj, and I'm going to go ahead and just speak it. Somebody's asking you about your speaking to private property in the crosshairs. He says it's very provocative. Do you see land trusts and real estate co-ops as hopeful transitional models, or are you more inclined to seek solutions that are more transformative?
That's a great question. Thank you, Matthew, for that. I mean, I like the idea of a land trust as a transitional space, right? I mean, it keeps the worst sort of excesses of capitalism at bay, which is the will and the need to seek profit. I mean, that's why, I mean, it's so interesting that the largest farmer in the United States now is Bill Gates. Billiam, I was going to call him, but Bill Gates Jr. And why is he America's biggest farmer? Well, because farmland is, to use the language of Madeleine Fairbairn, like gold with yield, right? You've got this asset, and it's an amazing asset. If you're a billionaire, you definitely want to be buying farmland, because what you get to do is take the farmland away from underneath the farmer, but the farmer stays there, keep the farmer there. And then you require the farmer to exploit the land so that you get your rent and you get your interest, and then perhaps the farmer gets to have something of a living as well. But you're all the while relying on this colonial system of externalities and subsidies so that someone else picks up the tab in terms of healthcare, in terms of planetary destruction, in terms of what have you, because this is a fantastic asset. You know that they're not making any more farmland, and it's brilliant if that's where you want to park your billions. A land trust stops that shit. And the idea that you can hold land and use capitalism's laws of private property against profit, I think is a useful interim measure until we rediscover the importance of territory, because there's and this is a sort of live tension in movements around, La Via Campesina, for example, the international peasant movement, which has now over 250 million members around the world, including here in the US. So La Via Campesina, it has some really interesting friction between campesinos and farmers and farm workers who are saying, look, here's some land, and we're definitely, we can turn this into a cooperative. And indigenous communities are like, no, this land isn't the same as that land over there. This territory is meaningful, and territory comes with a cosmology that may not be the same thing as you park into a land trust. And I think that these moments of friction are important, and they're worth embracing and really wrestling with. But in order for us to wrestle with them, we've got to take the profit, the sort of overwhelming power of profit and cycles of finance and capitalist exploitation out of the equation. And so, Matthew, I do think that a good land trust like the kinds that the Deep Medicine Circle is mooting at the moment can provide the respite until we, it's a space to hold the difficult discussions about territory and the layers of history and memory. So, for example, which indigenous community should hold Austin? There's so many layers of domination and exploitation that predate Mexico and the United States coming here. The Comanche Empire was itself an imperial power. And so, to figure that what we need is a return to territory is really to take sides on an issue that's very, very complicated and has many layers of indigenous history here. And so while that needs to be figured out, no one's pretending it doesn't need to be figured out, but what we need to do is hold space, and the trust is a great way of doing that.
Ooh, thank you. Rupa, do you have anything to add to that, or before I field the next question? Okay. Well, Raj, you mentioned cosmology, and so the next question I'd love to presence here is actually close to my heart as well. You both came from a medical world and we all know that the language of Western science is very compartmentalized, very fragmentary, reductionistic, right? And that's how we see the body, how we see the world. How can we shift, and how did you shift, and how are you recommending us to shift our language towards a cosmology that is more connective, not male-dominated, patriarchal? I know you're talking about indigenous, so is that the same thing? Go ahead.
Oh, this is a good question. I think that, so for myself, as a person who comes from another country, so I'm here because of colonial terror over there. My family came here because all the wealth was stolen from our nations, just like the refugees in Haiti are here. because of so much wealth that has been stolen from their territories. And now people move as they have when the resources are pinched. And colonialism has pinched the global South and continues to. So I think for people of great privilege, it's critical to start hanging out with people who don't look like you or talk like you, to start interacting and making real, authentic relationships and friendships with people who don't talk like you, because the language of English, if that's the only language you speak, or a Western language, a colonial language, it will impoverish your ability to make certain kinds of connections. Learning other languages, I think, is a really great idea, no matter how old we are. Learning the language of plants, learning the language of soil and land, but also learning the languages of people who are struggling differently, and actually are in a place of existential crisis and struggle, which Black and brown communities are around the world. So I think that listening is a critical part of this work, listening to the stories, listening to the other frameworks. For myself, I feel like just being in community in work has been really helpful. So serving at the will of different Indigenous groups and communities that have asked me to participate with them on certain things, that puts me in situations where I'm forced to listen and learn, and forced to become humbled in my own assumptions or understandings, and forced to abandon ones and go, okay, well, now I see where this comes from. And also learning like where these thoughts come from. And that's why Raj and I spent a good deal of time in the book talking about Enlightenment era ideas and how they have actually persisted and infected every aspect of our society. So that this binary mentality, the Cartesian dualism, all of these things limit our ability to see each other or see our earth body, our earthness, our earth connected selves, and understanding our own ancestries, like where do we come from? Stop practicing other people's medicines, for God's sake, and start reaching out to your own ancestors and to their medicines, and understand where you come from and understand the lineages of oppression that your families have been part of, so that you would come to this country and call yourselves white, when that's a fiction. It's it's a made up power stance, when we all come from these complex lineages. So I really think that ancestral work is really critical to this moment for all of us to do. And then for me, when I walk into a space, if it's mostly white people, I'm uncomfortable, and I'm like, oh God, here we are again. I'll say that to my husband, and now he's white, and now it's gotten to the point where like he'll walk into these places and be like, oh my God, it's so white, right? Because that means it's a place where power is not being shared. It's not a place of engagement. So if every white person felt that and went, oh God, I don't want to be in that space, and you would force themselves into spaces of organizing and being and interaction that were pluralistic, I think that would be a really great way to start, is develop that radar.
And I mean, there's just, I mean, in terms of a praxis, at least for some of the folk here, recognizing, like, raise your hands if you would like me to be more patriarchal. I'll wait. No one. All right. Well, so the idea that obviously no one wants to be more patriarchal. And for the rest of my life, I will be spending my life becoming less patriarchal, and that involves both learning, having the patriarchy knocked out of me through not just therapy, though to be honest, there's going to be some of that, but there's also going to be a lot of working in movement and with comrades who can call me on my shit, and who I can call, I can call other men on their shit, and we move forward so that we bury the legacy of patriarchy so that our children don't have to suffer it. And that's the work that we'll be doing that every day until we die. And that's not a burden, that's the duty of liberation. If we're talking about Numenera and duties, then the duties of liberation are to be confronting this stuff every day, because that's what it is to be free. And if you're not confronting it, then you're not being free. And that, again, I mean, as Rupa was saying so beautifully, there are folk who can school us. And the way that they school us is through movement and through organizing and through breaking, for example, patriarchy, and acting as if it's never been okay. Because it hasn't been okay. But until it is normalized that patriarchy is not okay, white supremacy not okay, capitalism not okay, then we'll find ourselves comfortable with it, and that's to have lapsed on our duties of liberation to one another and to ourselves. And so that's why some of the work I've been lucky enough to do over the past few years is work with movements in Southern Africa. And we were lucky enough to talk to Sibuzi Kode, the Shack Dwellers movement, Abahlali Bas and John Dolo, and also working with groups like Soils, Food and Healthy Communities. And I'm just going to sort of pimp out this article just because I think if we're interested in ways of thinking about patriarchy and race and land and transitioning, then there are movements here in the United States and throughout the world that can school us if we are humble enough to listen. And what's important is to do that listening and to recognize the science that white supremacy certainly has prevented. I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book is how colonial capitalism has always policed who can think and who can feel, right? What bodies are capable of thinking new thoughts and advancing new theories about the world? What kinds of bodies are capable of suffering and what really are just making squeaking sound, but not really suffering it in the same way? The adjudication of who can think and who can feel has always been part of colonial capitalism. And the minute that we surrender our human-centeredness, our privilege, our patriarchy, our white supremacy, our class privilege, and commit that to the flames, commit this kind of class suicide that we're talking about at the beginning, then all of a sudden that the process of how to do that is to be schooled by other people and to be schooled by frontline communities, to be schooled by folk in the global south, and to be schooled by folk whose bodies are not like ours, and that's good. So that I think is part of what we point to in Inflamed, and there's a lot more in the book which I'm excited that y'all might read, because there are so many ways and so many bodily systems and so many beings around us that can school us if only we have the wisdom to listen.
There's a great program in Oakland I recommend for everybody here through Tiny, formerly unhoused, just one of my favorite teachers, Tiny Gray Garcia, through Poor Magazine. She has a school called People School, and it's, she hosts it a couple times a year, and it is one of the most generous acts of love I've ever been a part of, where she brings in people of privilege, class privilege, race privilege, every kind of privilege, and sits them down and teaches with her comrades in the Decolonize Academy. So all formerly unhoused people tell their stories of, being poor and what their analysis is on what we need to be doing. And so when you go to that, and I recommend everybody goes and go often, almost invariably everyone's crying, because you're just hit by the tenderness and the generosity of spirit that is coming from people who are so deeply affected by this system of violence, and inviting you to be a part of the solution, to be part of the family. And that kind of radical generosity is something that I have seen in movement spaces all over the world. It just requires the courage to step in and to sit down and participate. And so that's not something you're going to get, handed to you by any government programming. So that's, that's something I'd recommend. Tiny has also written and compiled an amazing book of scholarship. And as Raj was saying, like, who gets to be the peer, who gets to be the scholar, whose knowledge is admitted into the realm of scholarship. I've tried to have Tiny speak at UCSF through the system so many times, and the doctors will say, well, she's not really a scholar. And to me, that is a great shame, because she could teach everybody there so much more about, what it is to address homelessness than what the kind of stuff that we see through our, data.
Whew. Yes. And that's why one thing I encourage, people to get involved in mutual aid work, because mutual aid work gives you that immersion experience often that you don't get anywhere else, where you really do get that experience of, it's very humbling. And that's, to work with people in the front lines of this climate crisis we're in, like the homeless, climate refugees, whatnot. It's very humbling, and it strips away if we're really honest and authentic about our efforts to do such a thing, it strips away that facade of thinking we're better than, or we're different than, when to see suffering like that, and to try to do our best to respond to it in a human, authentic way is really how I see the decolonizing work. In part. And then next week, we're going to be hosting a workshop with my good friend, Lisa Grayshield, who, by the way, I met in Standing Rock, which was an incredible boot camp for me as a white woman. Talk about getting stripped away. Anyway, I am totally bored in all white spaces, Rupa. So these days, anyway. But she's going to be talking about very much what you both are saying about find your own roots, reconnect to your own ancestry, reconnect to who you authentically are as a way to decolonize, and then take care of your own body, your own ecosystem, your physical being, because it's been colonized, right? We have to decolonize our bodies. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, and I can ask another question from the chat.
Yeah, I think that probably the most, that I saw some, like in like a she I call it she kind of like hipster magazine that featured mostly white people wearing turbans and doing yoga, like decolonize your diet, and so how these terms that are actually about the struggle for existence, not like what's hip and interesting to do, but like, can I actually drink water without being poisoned? Can I walk in my homelands without being poisoned? So the act of decolonization for frontline communities is desperate and urgent and a matter of life and death. The act of decolonization for people of privilege can feel more like a choice or a social movement du jour, and more of a kind of what makes me relevant today. And I want to just caution against that, because to remove the radical nature of this work is to denigrate and commit these people on the front line to these horrific realities that they are living and their bodies are being crushed by. So yes, we all have to take care of ourselves. We have to nurture ourselves, but not just for the fact of nurturing ourselves and connecting to our ancestry, but to get engaged and to be there on the front line, to use our bodies locked in step under the leadership of these impacted communities. And so that's, I just want to be sure that we're not turning into navel gazing and more into how do we put ourselves in service of these movements that are being defined by others, that these are not solutions that we will advance, but that we will be part of the solution. And so, yes, absolutely. I think that, that work is going to be really important to always do in relationship with impacted communities.
Yeah, and thank you. And that is my intention in that question. And a lot of the people that are attracted to the transition movement or this kind of summit are often quite active and quite doing stuff. And sometimes it's the balance of taking care of themselves needs to be there. So simultaneous taking, serving, acting, and taking care of ourselves, but not doing one at the sake of the other. And I agree with you about the term decolonizing, just like every other term, quantum, all these other things become like a fashion thing, so this goes back to the talking about language, how do we shift our language and not let it become, like even the term decolonize gets colonized, right?
There's, I mean, look, there's going to be no safe language. There's no unco-optable word, and there's no unco-optable movement. There's no guarantee that any of this is going to work out. That we won't. There's no guarantee that the world won't end in flames, and that we won't succeed in capitalism's end game of enriching a few people while the rest of the world burns to a crisp. And it's as well to be aware of that danger, because everything we're doing here is not just a competition to see who can be most woke, but about the future, the survival of us, our families, and our planet. Everything's at stake here. And the forces that are bent on making money as we die are very ready to colonize any word, pick a word, any word. Agroecology, for example. Nestle was trying to pimp out the idea that it was doing agroecology recently. And you can find all kinds of decolonizing X, Y, and Z bullshit. And we need to have a politics and an understanding and a community that is grounded enough to be able to call that shit out. But again, this is the sort of thing that's woven through practice, through organizing and on the ground control of territory and control of resources. And that's something that, mercifully, there is something of still a living history in this country. People who are able to remember the civil rights movement, people are able to remember the Black Panthers, people are able to remember the Communist Party, people are able to remember certain kinds of radical anarchist history in the Bay Area, for instance, will remember that these movements won things, and people who are living in community right now in the ways that Rupa is describing and engaging with are doing this fight right now. So, it's, yes, you'll hear all kinds of bullshit as as the planet burns. Some of it will come from just the capitalists you expect. Some of it will come through centrist liberals who, as we are day by day recognizing, are sometimes a far greater problem than the Ted Cruz's of this world. But when you hear these terms, and you hear this kind of obstructionism, you know what the answer is, and it's to organize and to mobilize, to withhold your labor power, to withhold your money, to withhold your participation, your assent, and to put your bodies on the gears of the machine, because there's no other way that we're going to be able to get through this. So let them try and co-opt decolonizing, but it's harder to do when we're blocking their guns and we're standing in front of their tanks.
Well, speaking of protesting and resisting, there's a couple people in the chat that mentioned something that's also, I think, is very interesting. Is there anybody that is standing up that you'd like to presence here against Big Pharma, since you're both medical doctors, and obviously that is like extreme of capitalism, colonization, right? So what's happening on that forefront?
Jewel, you are making my parents so happy. They wish I was a medical doctor, but no. I'm a doctor of political ecology, not a medical doctor. He's not a proper doctor. So
I would let him take care of me. I think he'd do a great job. Actually, well, I'm going to Texas. I'm going to Texas tomorrow to be under his care. So
awesome.
But Big Pharma, what about it? It's terrible.
Well, yeah, I mean, what kinds of fights are happening that people can join, that people can help, lift that up?
Single payer in California. Are we all in California? Are we mostly in California? Are we mostly? Where are we? Okay, Medicare for all for everybody else. But AB 1400 is going through the state legislature right now. Gavin Newsom being his failed recall really put some extra pressure on him to do something on single payer that he ran for. If we get single payer in California, especially through AB 1400, which is a bill that the California nurses, the union, helped to put forth, co-sponsored with Ash Kalra, we can set our prices for pharmaceuticals in California, and that would be a huge win. So if you don't like big pharma, and I don't like big pharma, if you don't like the financial oppression of the healthcare industry, AB 1400 would eliminate private health insurance in California. It would eliminate pharmaceutical control in California. So Medicare for all nationally, but if you're in California, really focus on AB 1400, because once we get that, once we make that happen, the rest of the country will fall like dominoes. California tends to lead on these kinds of issues, and it's time for us to do that. I was appointed by Governor Newsom to the Healthy California for All Commission to create a unified financing plan for the state of California, and single payer would get us everything that we want in terms of advancing health equity, improving access to healthcare, controlling prices, eliminating the fat at the top. And so I would say check out the California Nurses Association, CNA, and their work around AB 1400. That's a huge one. Other protests that are happening right now, it looks like San Francisco is advancing a debt strike against Veritas, one of the worst real estate groups. Line 3 is still active and it should be shut down. So there's plenty of things, lots of good stuff to get involved in. Raj, do you have any good food stuff happening that we can learn about?
There's always good food stuff happening, but I mean, you know, the kinds of policies and the kinds of vision that are standing in the way of this are, you know, folk involved in the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. You know, a People's Green New Deal that is radically recentering the idea of care and reframing the possibilities of exchange away from extractive capitalism to, you know, a radical redistribution. So when it comes to people, you know, there's brilliant groups taking on Monsanto or, you know, Bayer, and you know, there are valiant workers striking against JBS, the Brazilian meat conglomerate, and Tyson and what have you. And there are, you know, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union are doing some incredible stuff, sticking it to the man rather than sticking pigs. And they're very interested in the idea of a just transition away from industrial meat agriculture to worker-owned cooperatives that are about, you know, controlling and redistributing, you know, the fruit of the soil to a grocery store that's also union run and cooperatively held. So there are fantastic organizations of militant workers. But it needs to happen within a framework that breaks the rules that allows these fucking bastards to get away with what they're doing. And that means, again, you know, a fairly swift, I mean, you know, the problem is we can imagine by 2050 that we might have a rather different kind of political ecology, but we don't have time for 2050. Most of these changes need to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's what's hard. It's not that we can't imagine these policies, but you know, the sort of failure of our collective imagination to imagine winning is what's preventing us from imagining a 2025 with a lot of these victories substantially in place.
Yeah, that's, oh man, I wish, I guess I'll have to listen to the recording because I want to catch everything you said about ways to plug in. We do need to mobilize. We are mobilizing. The summit is part of that. And there are many other movements and organizations that are saying, okay, you know, roll up your sleeves. It's time. We can't wait for, you know, big government to do it. We are doing it. We are doing it. By the way, I also want to mention the next plenary, we're going to have Lila June Johnson. She's going to be speaking about the 7th generation New Deal. You mentioned the New Deal, so she's got that version. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. We're coming close to the close of our time, and I would love to hear some kind of closing remarks from both of you, and maybe any little tidbit from your book that maybe didn't get spoken to during this discussion. And then I'll let people know there's several workshops that we're having that all relate to a lot of things that got said here. So I'm so excited to keep this conversation going in many other sessions. So yeah, why don't we go ahead and just do whatever's on your mind from this conversation, any tidbits from the book, anything you'd like to say, Rupa, and then hand it over to Raj.
Oh gosh. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for joining this conversation and also for being active in this space. It's a critical space for us all to be involved in. I am just so grateful that there are so many people tuning in and waking up right now around the world. The earth is definitely screaming at us. So it's nice to see that people are tuning in and waking up, and that land is being moved back, that, cities are acknowledging the Ohlone people here. Alameda just passed a resolution, and not just acknowledging, but giving power in land. So that those things make me really hopeful that this is something that we can do together. I believe that we can find a new way of being together on this land that we have not yet experienced. I can see it, I can feel it. I believe there's a better way of being together on planet Earth. And I believe that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will really benefit from the work that we're laying out here today. And it requires, a deep reckoning and some discomfort, and some changing of patterns that we've all been conditioned in. And so I look forward to doing that work with you all and making music about that work and singing and dancing and, composting our grief together and really coming into, real community together to do this hard work. So thank you. I'm tired as a frontline person, as a doctor. I'm going on vacation for the first time since March, starting tomorrow. And I'm just excited. I'm excited for the future.
And I see that there's a fantastic chat discussion about whether I'm allowed to say shit or not. But I leave that for you to figure out if that's perhaps the topic we want to leave with today. Instead, what I want to leave with is, as treasurer of the Deep Medicine Circle, encourage you to click on Deep Med. Let me just paste it in. There we go. Click on that, and if you would, and I will use my best language, encourage you to part with some cash and use that as a swear jar for me, because the Deep Medicine Circle is doing incredibly good work and could do with your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really enriching in so many different ways. I look forward to more conversation with you, Rupa, and I'm so glad that you're getting a vacation. Are you only getting a week because you're coming back for the plenary?
Unfortunately, my family has to endure a couple talks when I'm on the road, but they've agreed to be swimming or doing something equally fun while I'm holed up with a laptop.
All right, well, good. I'm going to be thinking of you and sending good juju for your relaxing, de-stressing time, and just, yeah, grateful for all that you're doing. And Raj, thank you so much. I know you have this whole other wealth of discussion that people in the chat are wanting to have, and it's like there's so much room for more discussion around food and all of the stuff that you're very involved in. And gosh, I wish we had more of you. So we'll just have to find other ways. Maybe if you have, besides that link that you gave us, if there's other ways that we can know about you. And
his movie, is there a link to your movie you could send people to, Raj? Is it still screening? It's such a beautiful movie. I recommend it highly.
Thank you very much, Rupa. Yes.
thank you. And do you have a preferred way that people buy your book? I was going to put in the Amazon thing, and I thought, no, I don't support Amazon it myself. So, do you have a preferred way that people could buy your book?
Ideally through their local bookstore, and if not, bookshop.org. But we ask that everybody writes a review on Amazon, even if you didn't buy it there, because even though we hate Amazon, it matters. It helps us get the word out about the book more, the more they see reviews. So I would appreciate that.
Okay, bookshop.com.
Yes, and I just wanted to respond to the shit comment. Raj and I have, I think, about almost half as many pages in the book of references as we do to what we actually wrote. So for the person who wanted more detail than just the word shit, there's tons of detail in our book. So please get it, read it, and tell us what you think.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again. And yeah, I hope you can, if you feel moved to come to any of our sessions, we'd love to have you, and hope to have you again some other time down the road. And we'll see you again, Rupa, next week.
Yes, and say hi to Lila June for me. She's a good friend.
Oh, yeah. She's awesome.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Take care. Thank you, everybody, for coming.